My name's Jo Kavanagh, and I'm really delighted that Irfan and Sophie have asked me to chair this session with a stunning panel we have of successful social entrepreneurs who are going to share with us in a little bit some of their work, and then we'll have an opportunity for some questions and interaction with you. And I believe there are microphones ready for when we get to that. So please do be thinking about questions you'd like to ask and how to engage with our panel. In starting, let me acknowledge that we're on the land of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also pay respects and appreciate the culture and wisdom of our First Nations people, who have much to offer us from looking to the past for a better way into the future, for right relationships with the land and between people. Let me introduce to you these three awesome people we have joining us on the stage, just briefly, and then they're going to speak each for 5 to 6 minutes about the work that they do, and just be holding in your mind as we do that the challenges and successes of collaboration. Beck Scott may be well known to many of you as the CEO of Street and co-founder of Street, a Melbourne-based social enterprise working with marginalised young people. Amazing. I remember Rebecca when she first started. She's now, I can't believe this, she now has a portfolio of 11 food service businesses, including cafes, an artisan bakery, a catering company, and a coffee roastery. I remember when she had her first van, I think it was, coffee van cart. That's an extraordinary success story. And then during COVID, she's been working on collaborating a collective of social enterprises called Moving Feast for a fair and regenerative food system. Much more I could say about each of these panellists, but I'm going to keep it brief. And then we have Kai, at the end here, who is the Chief Convener at Regen Melbourne, a mission-led network exploring a more regenerative future for our city. And he's also the entrepreneur in residence at Small Giants Academy and collaborates on the Academy's education and storytelling initiatives. He's also on the board of Type Human, which is a pretty exciting initiative looking at emerging technology and how it's affecting human dignity and public life. And Roberto Daniele, did I say that right? Daniele, on the end here, who's an educator, social entrepreneur, and world cyclist. He took 3 years to ride from Oxford all around the world to Melbourne, and we're very lucky he landed here before COVID. He's now based here in Melbourne as the founder and director of Changemakers Lab, a social enterprise consultancy specialising in supporting social entrepreneurship startups. So they all have very current and real experience to share with us about new ways of collaborating. And in introducing them, one of the things or setting this up for the conversation, is that we know, and Stanford University writes prolifically about how difficult it is to collaborate, all the things that get in the way. And the reason we know that is because we've been trying to do it for a long time. And I've certainly had the opportunity to be involved in some of those collaborations. But it also means that we've got lots of good lessons to learn. I think one of the big learnings in recent times is to look to other cultures and get outside whatever our own culture is to find other ways of working and collaborating. So I'm going to hand over first of all to Roberto, who's going to share with you his work, and don't forget to write those questions down for later. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. Thank you, panel. I cannot tell you the pleasure it gives me to see people in the flesh. This is my first conference post-pandemic, and I can tell you I'm so over Zoom that it's, I'm presuming it's the same with all of you. Right, only problem I had to wear trousers, but that's another story. So I'm here really not to tell you much about Changemakers Lab, which is my company, but I'm here more to tell you about Catalyst 2030, which is an organization for whom I chair the Australasia chapter. So really the focus of this organization is very much activating collaborations with social enterprise, and so that's really the topic of my talk, and then we'll go into the panel session. So who we are an international coalition of now about 1,100 social entrepreneurs and social enterprises who have understood that we need to catalyze much stronger collaboration to be successful. And the collaboration is directed to the achievement of the SDGs. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we are 1,000 plus members. We cover all the 17 SDGs. We operate in 190 countries, soon to be about 195 countries. And the organization is only 2 years old. So that's part of the power of collaboration. Next slide. So why was this formed where there's so many international organizations that deal or represent social enterprises? This was formed, Catalyst 2030 was formed about 2 years ago at a Davos meeting when it dawned on people that really the SDGs that were supposed to be achieved by 2030 has slipped to 2082. If you look at the Social Project Index, we're not going to get there by 2082. And this was before the pandemic. The pandemic, there's general consensus is that adding another 10 years. So we're looking at something for which the UN had committed to achieve by 2030, now, if we're lucky, 2092, which I think you all agree is not acceptable. And so, the recognition came that, yes, social enterprise around the world, and particularly here in Australia, is dynamic, a lot of things happening, but unless we have much, much stronger levels of collaborations, we're just not going to get there, or at least we're not going to get there in the time frames that are required and the urgency that is required. So Catalyst was born 2 years ago, and it's been an incredible role. I joined about a year and a half ago, with about 300 members. As I said, there's 1,000. There's been loads and loads of initiatives, which I don't have time to talk here, but I'm just amazed on how much has been achieved in so little time through collaboration. And I think one of the important things, and I hope we're going to touch more on that during the panel session, is that if you want to have a truly collaborative environment, you need to make sure that you get your North Star well set. And so a lot of work with the early days of Catalyst was in setting up very clear values and principles, which I'll go through. Bear with me. Next slide. In a second. So our core values, and this is actually a pledge. It sounds like a bit Masonic temple, but when we induce members into Catalyst, we actually get them to go with this pledge, because it's very, very important for us. So the core values of Catalyst are, first of all, putting people and nature at the center of everything we do. So we place people and nature and their ways of life at the heart of what we do, and most importantly, we stand accountable to them for our action. So that's pledge number one. Second one, being about collaboration, is about co-creative mindset. And we are absolutely clear that the future of innovation, any innovation that's going to come, has to be collaborative and has to be co-created. So we seek to acknowledge our biases, our silos, and to move beyond them. And I think this was echoed in a few presentations this morning, okay? So for us, this means that everything that we produce at Catalyst, okay, is shareable, okay? All the data, all the collaborations, whatever Catalyst produce is non-proprietary. If you go to our website, you will find a minefield of information, a minefield of reports, which are shared with everyone. Importantly, we are all about collaborative leadership, so we prioritize co-creating approaches that reflect shared ownership and create a collective impact. Leaders stand back in this organization, and we believe very much in collective impact. Shared norms are based on the needs and challenges we face. The next one is one that's very close to my heart, and it's humble audacity. So we have at Catalyst very, very audacious goals. We want to bring back from 2092 to 2030, okay? So we are extremely ambitious with our goals, but we approach these goals with humility and with the knowledge that none of us, absolutely none of us alone, can achieve those goals. And unless we collaborate, we're not going to get there. Spirit of generosity is the other important one, and that is very much lived throughout the organization. On any given day, we are donors, we're doers, we're visionaries, we work with our clients, okay? So we commit to sharing the knowledge, time, and our personal networks or our organizational networks freely without any expectation of having anything in return. And I stress that. It's all about, if you join this organization, it's all about giving for the achievement of collective goals. We have a lot of big-name consultants knocking at the door, joining, looking for the consultancy, and leaving after 2 weeks after they realize that they have to give way, way more than what they can get back. And that's the spirit of the organization, which is very important for us. We also have some core principles. If you could go to the next slide, sorry. Actually, let's go back to mission and in a second. Could we go one more slide to core principles, please? Yeah, here we go. Convening, getting people together, it's very important to us. Connecting, using collaborative systems to change principles to connect actors across diverse communities. Again, mentioned this morning, to generously share knowledge and resources, to inspire the community of actors towards acceleration and progress to the SDGs. Very important. Co-creation, we do a lot of collaborative systems, whether it's platforms, whether it's groupings that I'll tell you a bit more about, to achieve the goals that we want to do. Important for any organization is celebration. We celebrate the wins. We have general assemblies once a month, and all the wins that we have, which I'm glad to say are many, are shared and celebrated across the network globally. Calibration is a very important thing for any organization, but particularly for a new organization and growing organization, where we need to be able to, while still moving very fast, we need to be able to reflect and gather data and reflect on where we're going and adjust the trajectory as this happens. Cohere, okay, we need to develop much coherence within the community, activities and organizations that make up Catalyst. If you look at the scope and breadth of the SDGs, of course, there's social enterprises that are doing very, very diverse work, and part of the work of the Secretariat is to find common areas of action, common areas in which we can collaborate, despite being in different fields. Last but not least, and again, mentioned this morning very much, is that change of consciousness. So shifting norms away from focus of individuality to believe that individual and community prosperity can be achieved in the same action. So they're not in antithesis, they are, it's the usual Ubuntu, I am because you are. So we can achieve that collectively. Can we go next slide? This is the Catalyst House, okay, how we call it, the Catalyst House, where basically we have the vision, the objectives, and the support organism that we have for working Catalyst. So vision is a world where social change, innovation fulfill the potential to achieve the SDGs. And I wanted to stress these 3 pillars. First of all is that enabling of collaboration between social enterprises. Catalyzing collaborative action, and most importantly, because we're on a learning journey, one of our biggest groups is the Learning for System Change group, and is basically building up a learning culture of how do we learn about collaboration within the network. All of that is, of course, about with those foundations that I mentioned before. Last but not least, the next slide, this is what a distributed organization looks like, okay? As you can see, there's no hierarchy in the organization. In fact, interestingly enough, Catalyst is not even an organization, okay? So both Catalyst Global and Catalyst Australasia and all the Catalysts around the world are not incorporated, are not NGOs, are not charities. We are a loose movement. We back, for practical reasons, to One Family Foundation back in Europe that has all the bank accounts and all the bureaucratic bits that you need to have to exist, but everything else is networked. And what we work around is basically those big components there. So the first one is the General Assembly, and the General Assembly is basically the assembly of all the individual organizations that make Catalyst, and this is actually the major decision-making body. No major decision or policy direction or project goes ahead unless it's been voted and accepted by the General Assembly. We then have a board, okay, that helps the General Assembly conceptualize some of the work and steer some of the direction, but again, taking very strong input, in fact, the majority of the input from the General Assembly. Yeah, 1 minute. Local chapters, which is what we are, for example, so we have about 25 local chapters around the world. Collaboration corners, so people, different social enterprises coming across from different countries to collaborate on specific initiatives. And then we have working groups. We have about 21 working groups on all sorts of areas, on gender, on equality, on racism, on climate change, on First Nations, etc. Task forces, these are more temporary groups that get together to achieve certain tasks and whatever. And then what we said, was mentioned before, we have the Secretariat, which is basically the base organization that really works in the background, works to support all the activities that we carry out from the chapters and from the groups. And they provide much needed support to the activists, to people like me who are volunteers and don't have all the backup that you need to make an initiative run smoothly, etc. So all that background is provided by the Secretariat. And on that, I think I need to call it back.
So I'm not very good at standing still behind a microphone. I tend to be a free-range chicken, so I'm going to be a bit stir-crazy here. For the last decade, I've been building social enterprises, and I've just used essentially a social enterprise business model to try and do innovation. And what I was trying to do when I started out kind of building initially with my partner is we decided to come here to Melbourne and try and build proof that you could build a social enterprise business model, that you could embed young people who needed opportunities right in the heart of that business model. And then what we would do is try and scale it to prove that you can scale these things to the point of financial sustainability. I got closer and closer to my 10-year kind of anniversary and long service leave, and I knew that it would be a time when I'd have to do a lot of reflection of like, what am I doing for the next 10 years? When I started Street, my board chair and I had a conversation and I said, I'm in for 10 years and then we'll reconsider. So I went for long service leave at the 10-year mark, had done most of the things that we had wanted to do, and then was sitting overseas kind of contemplating life and what the next 10 years looks like. And I just kept on thinking, the criticality for this point of time in human history. I can't believe that I'm at a point in my career with an established social enterprise at a time when it feels like we're at the pointy end of human history. We're at this incredible acupuncture point in human history. And imagine knowing that we've got kind of a 10-year window to make many of the changes that we have to make, and that the scale of the threat is existential. And imagine being given the privilege and the opportunity to try and do your best work in that time. And people talk about burning platforms. Well, there's nothing like a burning platform than not existing as a species, and 9 million other species not existing. So I kind of figure we've got the world's largest burning platform, literally, to do our best work in. So sitting overseas, I came back to Australia and recommitted for the next 10 years, building my enterprise to now go into bigger system work. So we were only a couple of months into that work when the pandemic hit. And I kind of feel like I'm an imposter standing up here and talking about collaboration, because all I did really in the pandemic is speed dial some friends. That we were, all of our social enterprise businesses were all closing, but what I could see is that a whole heap of other social enterprises, also in the food and hospitality sectors, were all closing as well. Our traditional customers weren't there, and it kind of made no sense that at a time when we were going to see rising hunger, to have all of these social enterprises that do social and environmental good at the heart of their businesses all closing their doors. So all I did really is just speed dial a bunch of friends and say, do you want to leave your kitchens open and do you want to start making food relief meals? The really nice thing though was in the process of making those meals, we started to have more conversations and said, well, what does it look like beyond the pandemic? If we've found the impetus to start to collaborate now, even though we've all been in the same ecosystem together for a decade, well, what does it look like for us to continue to collaborate going into the future? So we mapped out 3 phases of our work, the first being essentially relief meals, so working in food relief, the second being recovery, and the third in regeneration. So what we've got is a bunch of social enterprises that are now working together to build a fair and regenerative food system for Victoria. I'm not going to show you heaps of slides, but I will ask you to go forward to, go to the next one if that's all right. The one before that, if that's possible. Many of you would have remembered when we had the tower lockdowns, so when our public housing estates were closed rapidly and we had a large number of community members locked into their houses. This is some of the work that we were doing during that time. In that week, a whole heap of social enterprises came together to create and cook 12,000 meals, all culturally appropriate halal meals that went across into those public housing estates. And I'm really proud of the work that we did that week, but let me show you a year later what that looks like. So on the left-hand side is a tower, and that was the tower I was standing outside in the first photo. So that's the Flemington housing estate where we were delivering the meals to as a bunch of social enterprises. But a year later, we're outside those same towers building food infrastructure for the people in those towers. What you probably won't recognise yet because you can't see it from the photo, but this is all new community garden infrastructure going in, but all totally accessible by people who are wheelchair bound or have mobility issues. So some of the first community gardens going into Victoria that have all accessibility for people and will provide, years and years and years of food for security for the families who are there. If you go to the next one. These are the areas that we decided as a group of social enterprises that we wanted to work around. So work that we could see that needed to be done in circular economies and inclusive employment and regenerative farming and a whole bunch of areas that felt like they kind of brought us all together. But not just kind of in siloed work. We wanted to work out how do we embed ourselves and weave a big structure. So if you go to the next one, please. So these are the social enterprises. And then I'll ask one more, thanks. And this is the relationship between all of those social enterprises. So what we're trying to do is weave together all of these social enterprises together, all working on different projects. So some of us are now working on multi-year projects, creating training and employment pathways together. Some of us are working on tiny little projects. Some of us are just working maybe, with 1 or 2 other organisations, but now we've got a whole series of other projects that are multi-year projects that sometimes have up to 8 enterprises in them. I'm really interested though in how, this is just the very, very first seeds of a collaboration. It's not remarkable to get people to come and collaborate with you if you've got a pot of money and you say, do you want to come and get some money from us? That's not remarkable at all. Of course people are going to come and collaborate with you if you've got some resourcing. We happened to go to a major philanthropic foundation and said to them, if you gave us a pot of money, You would need to trust us, and as soon as you give us that money, we're going to give it away to all of our peers. So the RACV Foundation gave us $250,000 that we really quickly distributed across that whole network to start getting things moving. So it's not remarkable if you've got a pot of money and you speed dial friends to say, do you want some money and do you want to collaborate? The real rubber hits the road in the coming years as we don't have the same kind of disruption now. It's easy to collaborate when you've got no customers as well, but now all our businesses are reopening. So I'm really interested in what does this little seed turn into? If we take this little seed and we let it grow and we nurture it over the coming years, what's possible? So if I could take some photos, let me describe the future photos that I hope will be up there in a couple of years' time. So that first photo was standing outside the towers with the food relief meals. Photo 2 being now building food infrastructure for those same communities. Photo 3, I don't have a photo of that, but photo 3 is us now having the same young people who are unemployed in those towers coming and training with us as young urban farmers. So that's my next photo. We've just opened our doors on the 8th of August, and there'll be 50 young people coming from crisis situations, and a lot of them coming from social housing estates to come and get training and employment pathways. So that's the third photo that I want to show you in a year's time. The next photo that I want to show you in probably a year after that is a photo where at least 10% of the people in those towers are now working with us and collaborating to build new food enterprises. So what does it look like when we start to create not just social enterprises that are doing great work and have great beneficiaries, but what does it look like when we build a participatory economy? What does it look like when the social enterprise sector opens all of its doors and windows and invites its community in, not just as beneficiaries, but as co-creators of new enterprise activities? So that's my hope. We know from the research that to really activate communities where there's been large-scale participation, it takes between 10 and 15% of a population to be engaged to really light the spark. So I just think the opportunities that we've got in this next decade are not just opportunities for us to be solo entrepreneurs or even collaborative entrepreneurs, but it's to create the right enabling environment for participation and participatory ecosystems. What does it look like when every single organisation says everything inside here is yours to come and share? Of course, that means doing strategy differently. It means building different organisational structures. It means doing away with the traditional way that we fund organisations. It certainly means it's different in the way we do programs. And I think all of these things are there for innovation and change. So I'm really looking forward to kind of the coming couple of years, as what we try and do is open every door and window in the organisation, invite others to come and be part of it. And if any of that is interesting to you, please come and chat to me later. Thanks.
Thanks, Beck. Thanks, everyone. I mean, it's a thrill to be here. Roberto said it was a bit weird being in person. It is, but it's also really nice. And it feels unbelievably appropriate to be coming after Beck and Roberto. And I guess, so I come at this conversation, I just wanted to sort of contextualise us a little bit more broadly and then locate us in place. So if you zoom back in time to pre-pandemic, we were just coming out of the most devastating fires in years. Smoke was in our city, it was choking our kids, it was in our schools, it was everywhere, and we were really reeling, I think, as a community as a result. Not because we didn't know this was coming or because anything new was necessarily learnt about the climate catastrophe. I think it was just the lived experience of the smoke in the lungs in places where we didn't necessarily have had that experience before that suddenly connected, I think, that conversation for many, many people. And we were just coming out of that summer and I think starting to have some really interesting conversations about what does that mean, and then the pandemic hit. And we had this other experience which connected us through not just an ecological lens, but through a social and community and cultural and, of course, public health lens. And my reflections on that time are, and really across the last couple of years, is that we've had this remarkable set of experiences that expose to us not only the very many challenges that our economies have created, but also the connections between those concerns. And so when we throw words around like systems change, which I think often can land a bit flat because people can't grasp the language, and I think the language is quite poor at describing what it actually is, I prefer to fall back on the experiences we've had in the last couple of years where we can see how economic inequality is linked to public health, which is linked to our food systems, which is linked to our ecology in a very, very lived experience sense. And I think what we've experienced, of course, is that that system, when we think about systems change, the system that we've created is failing. It's failing ecologically, it's failing socially, and it's failing economically. And at the height of the second lockdown, a whole bunch of people, individuals and organisations, came together to talk about, well, what does that mean and what comes next? And this was basically the emergence of this network that's now called Regen Melbourne, and this is about a year ago. So the little story that I'm going to share is only a year old, and it's incredibly early stage and emerging. But I think there's something in the idea that will give it some value in the coming years. And so what we did was come together in about July last year around this idea of, well, what is the model? What can we look to contextualise this systems feeling that we have? And the model that we started talking about was donut economics. And hands up if you've heard of the term or understand what that is. Great. So I'm not going to do a one-on-one in donut economics, but this is the model. The reason it's beautiful and simple is not that it presents new data or science or even context. It's that it puts in image this idea of connection, interconnection, interrelationship between all of the social concerns in the inner circle and all the ecological barriers and ceiling that we face in the outer circle. With the goal, of course, being that we need to get our cities, our towns, our countries, our world into the safe and just space that sits between the social foundation and the ecological ceiling. So we were rallying around this idea, like, what does this mean for Melbourne? What does this mean for the place that had had the longest lockdown in the world? And so we started a series of workshops. So if you go to the next phase, a bunch of us got together and we said, well, let's set up a community engagement process, a listening process, workshops that we can do while in lockdown from our computers and talk about this. And about 500 people, about 50 organisations came together to explore this model using this little timeline. So we did a bunch of workshops, which are the blue bubbles, a bunch of interviews, and we did a bunch of round tables. And then we presented a report at the end of April, which basically said, this model has usefulness for Melbourne. We can use this model to start thinking about how we can do what Rebecca was talking about. How do we work together better as a city? And how do we put Melbourne at the centre of those conversations? So not whether we're a business or a non-profit or whether we work in government, but let's centre the place. So what I wanted to share with you is just a couple of the outputs of that process. So one was this vision statement. So this was the vision statement that 500 plus people collectively came up with in a bunch of different visioning sessions, which is a really beautiful statement. It speaks to we want to have a city that's built on knowledge, that's full of life, that's connected through its cultures, that's clearly affordable, collaborative, and it has a set of systems. That last one is interesting, a set of systems that enables that vision to come to life. Happy to talk about that a little bit more. But the second thing we did on the next slide is we contextualized this macro model. So this macro model of the donut has been built by an economist called Kate Rayworth, and it uses the Sustainable Development Goals that Roberto was talking about as its foundation. And it uses the planetary boundaries work that came out of the Stockholm Resilience Centre as its ceiling. So you can see that model on the left. It's a beautiful model, but it doesn't work at a city scale, primarily because we have completely different contexts depending on where this lands. So the process we went through added a number of elements to the central area, the social foundation, including art and culture, which is very poorly represented in the SDGs. It also added this idea that we can't reach these technical targets unless we reconnect with one another and we reconnect with country and with place. So it just adds a little bit of texture to this model. So that's sort of point number two. And the third thing that came out of this process was the next slide, which is a set of roadmap, basically a set of actions that the community wanted to take. We don't have to dwell here, but basically all I wanted to say is that there was like a tangible outcome, which led to this report being published at the end of April. So on the next slide, or the next set of slides, we basically went through a process where we're like, well, how do you take this community research process that we've been through and transition that to become an operating network for the city? How do you do that? How do you design that? And certainly, as Rebecca said, how do you resource that? So what we landed on was that there's unbelievable collaboration in this city. We're actually really collaborative. we've got wonderful pockets in various systems and sectors that do this really well, in housing, in climate change, clearly in food, which Rebecca's spoken about. But what's missing and what really is a gap in many, many places is a place for cross-sector collaboration, for unique alliances to tackle systems-based problems, things that are too big for one sector to grapple with. And that's what we think Region Melbourne can do. So on the next slide, you can see how we're organising. So this has been received really well in lots of places. We have managed to secure a little bit of anchor funding, which means that we can recruit a very small team to support this network to do work together. And these are the 4 areas. So we want to continue the research. We want to work with universities and bridge that to lived experience research that we've been doing. We want to work on systems projects and support system projects to take place. Things like making the Yarra swimmable by 2030, which has been an initiative that's been played with from lots of different angles for a long time in Melbourne, but we think a networked approach can add a huge amount of value. We think there's a story to be told about Melbourne's recovery, being the city that's been in lockdown the longest out of, I think, any city anywhere in the world. What does that recovery narrative look like? What do we hold on to as a city? And then finally, we believe in the art of convening. We want to come together. So there's going to be forums, there's going to be processes through that online and offline. So that's all I wanted to share. Happy to answer questions. But I just wanted to put Melbourne at the heart of this conversation. Thanks.
Now we might put one microphone down here for audience members, and I'll give one to the panel. Okay, thank you. Here you go, panel. Thank you. Whoops. So, where's the audience microphone gone?
Hello.
Oh. Okay,
Yeah.
so if you would like to ask a question in a few minutes, I'll get you to put your hand up. I'm just going to throw one question to, perhaps first of all to you, Beck. In the process of inviting everyone to come together, what was different about doing that in the context of a pandemic as opposed to when you started the 10 years beforehand, when you were asking people to be generous and to give?
I mean,
Tap the top.
okay, cool. Thanks. One of the outcomes of lockdown is our now need glasses, so I'm probably not even pressing the right button. Look, we've collaborated with our peers a lot over the years, but nowhere to the same scale. I feel like if we'd tried to collaborate without the pandemic and without the burning platform that was quite so immediate, it would have been longer and slower, and I suspect that everyone would have been way too busy. Yep. So the survival kind of need kicked in for all of those enterprises, and I suspect that there were a bunch of enterprises who decided to collaborate because they didn't really have lots of other options. There were resources there were opportunities there. Having said that, I speed dialed people where there was already social capital. So one of the interesting things was there were people that I didn't call. There were people that I knew that if I called them, everything would slow down and it would be harder. So people who were fantastic and had great enterprises, but I went where there was already trust and social capital. So really what I was doing is kind of mining the social capital that was there. So it was a very selective kind of cherry picking. But having said that, now we want to broaden it out and bring in more organisations. But I feel like the people that you speed dial at the beginning are quite crucial for probably how much momentum you get and how much alignment that you get in the philosophy of how you want to behave together. And there were probably some kind of missing groups, but we felt like we would have created too much noise and slowness in the system to probably even kickstart it.
So Kai, what about for you, in being only 12 months old? Are you starting with known social capital, or are you trying to get the unusual suspects in?
Yeah, I think is that working? Yep. I think it's an unbelievably interesting point of tension, because I think what Beck's talking about is absolutely right. When we're starting things, particularly in the context that we're in, where there is people are being driven both by hope and fear in probably equal measure, that there is an unbelievably important principle, which is to follow the energy, because tactically that's, I think, how you build momentum, it's how you build movements, it's how you generate impact. However, of course, particularly for us, the energy that we're following in our initial stages is very selective energy. It's people who have quite significant privilege, it's people who have job security, it's people who are running organisations that are going okay, that aren't necessarily existentially facing existential crisis through the pandemic. And so I think it's both being, following the energy and being unbelievably conscious about what that means for the people who are in the room and the people who aren't in the room. And I think the maturing of these types of collaboratives is in recognising that, seeing it early, and working out how we, as you're saying, expand the collective to make sure that we're not claiming representation where it hasn't been earned. And that's a really fine line and a lifelong journey, I'm sure. But I think that's where we're at as a network now, just expanding that out and walking carefully.
And Roberto, for you, thinking about that at a global level, how do you get that connection and engagement?
I think my microphone is not working. I think that element of alignment and clarity of purpose is a really important factor for people wanting to join in. So for us, it's and I emphasize, relatively easy job in the sense that we have a very clear North Star, which is collaborating for achieving the SDGs. So, and we have a lot of parameters around that make it clear what the mission is. And so I think it's easier to coalesce when there is a very clear mission and clear mechanisms for support that collaboration. So that, I think, is the most important part for Catalyst, to foster that.
So you're really calling out the coordination function there and how important that is.